that when we look back at the 2010 decade. Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk about the 25th anniversary of quite possibly the most famous event in the history, the illustrious history of professional wrestling in North America and specifically in Canada. And that is the Montreal Screwjob that took place in November of 1997 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, at what was then the Molson Center. It was the Survivor Series, the annual event that they had done up to that point for 10 years. They started in 1987, which in itself is a huge has a huge back has a huge crazy backstory. Vince McMahon basically started the event as an annual Thanksgiving tradition to block or to counter program Jim Crockett Promotions 1987 edition of Starrcade. Of course, Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving anyway, um, wrestling wrestling on Thanksgiving was a huge tradition going back to the 1950s and 60s. That time, football wasn't as entrenched. Thanksgiving football wasn't as entrenched in American consciousness, in American culture as it later became. So the 50s and 60s, after the Thanksgiving dinner, people would go out with their families to places like the Greensboro Coliseum in Greensboro, North Carolina, and have wrestling. AWA did the same thing in Minnesota. I think Vince Senior's company, the WWF, did the exact same thing in New York. People would do this all over the country. So in 1983, Jim Crockett Promotions decided to put it on closed circuit, and that became the first Starrcade. Fast forward to 1987, Vince says, okay, we want to counter program that. We want to put on their Survivor Series. So cable companies thought they could put on both at the same time. And Vince was like, no, if you don't carry Survivor Series exclusively, then you can't carry the upcoming year's WrestleMania, which is WrestleMania 4 from Plaza. So most cable companies didn't carry Starrcade 87. The main event ended up flopping anyway because they were supposed to have Magnum TA versus Ric Flair. Magnum TA got into his motorcycle accident and he was forced to retire, so they put the belt on Ronnie Garvin, and that really wasn't drawing the fans in anyway. So from that point on, 88 and up until I think 94, NWA, which later became WCW, moved the Starrcade event to like around Christmas time, the day after Christmas. So flash forward again 10 years later in 1997, the war is still going on, and it has in many ways heated up because in 1993, because of his racially insensitive comments, Bill Watts is moved out of the position as the head of WCW. Eric Bischoff, who was the third string announcer, came into WCW after the closing of the AWA in 1991, tried to apply for a job with Vince McMahon in the World Wrestling Federation, wasn't hired. So he comes into WCW at that point. Then he later becomes the boss thanks to some advocating on the part of people like Jesse Ventura, people like Diamond Dallas Page, people that had known him from his Minnesota / AWA days, say, oh, he would be a good person as the executive producer because they didn't want any more wrestling people. They tried it with Ole Anderson after Bill Watts and prior to Bill Watts, I think in uh, 90, 91 when they did the Black Scorpion thing at Starrcade. 1990, where it was supposed to be Al Perez, and then it was different guys going against Sting as the Black Scorpion. That didn't work, so Dusty Rhodes leaves the WWF in 1991, comes back to WCW. They tried with him booking. Of course, he brings back the Four Horsemen. That doesn't work. Then they tried it with Watts when they brought him in 92. He gets rid of the light heavyweight division, and he also cuts the pay of many wrestlers. They don't like him. Then he says something in the torch about I'm insensitive about gay people and specifically about black people. It gets back to people in the higher ups at Turner Broadcasting, and he's fired. Especially Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron hears about it. He gets Bill Watts fired. Then in 93, I think it was Starrcade 93, Vader versus Ric Flair. That was the first time they bring in Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff turns the company around later on, almost immediately, thanks to the connection of Ric Flair, who had left the WWE in the early part of 1993, come back to WCW, and he kind of, at first he likes Eric Bischoff, so he hooks Eric Bischoff, he connects Eric Bischoff with Hulk Hogan, who he had previously worked with in the WWF. And Eric Bischoff then brings Hulk Hogan after Hogan, was let go in the WWF because of the steroid controversy. Vince McMahon was under the investigation of the federal government. He almost went to jail in 1994. Throughout the early 90s, they got rid of the Ultimate Warrior. They got rid of the British Bulldog. They got rid of people like the Warlord, people that were big steroid muscle heads, and they switched to Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels almost immediately. Almost immediately. One pay-per-view event, the 1992 SummerSlam, they have Macho Man Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior as the co-main event for the WWF title. Then immediately the next pay-per-view, Survivor Series 1992, they switched to Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels without warning. And out of nowhere, Bret Hart wins his first WWF championship in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan from Ric Flair. And Vince again is getting rid of all these muscle heads, Hulk Hogan included. So in 1994, Bischoff brings in Hulk Hogan. In July of 1994, and immediately Vince McMahon too makes a pivot because in June of 1994, the June King of the Ring, he starts to operate under this new generation marketing scheme. He's getting rid of the old silver block logo that the WWF has used since he's taken over in 1982. And he is using a new logo. He is marketing new stars. He's marketing Diesel, Razor Ramon, who is Scott Hall, Diesel, who is Kevin Nash, Bret Hart, and Shawn Michaels. And The Undertaker. These five guys are the guys that are the core of the new generation. Despite the fact that the first pay-per-view of the new generation, the main event is Jerry the King Lawler versus Roddy Piper. Still, they are basically telling you that people like Hulk Hogan, especially who wasn't with the company anymore, are old school, old hat. They're putting them in the category of like a Chief Jay Strongbow, like an Antonino Rocca, like a Bruno Sammartino. They are considered old school. You shouldn't like them anymore. You should like these new guys that are featured. And Macho Man is on commentary for that event, but they're about to move Macho Man out of the WWF as well. And in December of 1994, Eric Bischoff signs over the Macho Man Randy Savage. So now he has the Macho Man Randy Savage and he has Hulk Hogan. And he's off to the races. And in 1995, as WCW is expanding itself internationally, is getting distribution in China, he goes to talk to Ted Turner about the Chinese distribution. And from there, Ted Turner just says to him, "What do we have to do to compete with the World Wrestling Federation?" He said, and Ted Turner looks at the head of Turner Programming at that time, Scott Sassa, and he's like, "Give Eric an hour every Monday night live." And this was unprecedented because Raw in the beginning in 1993 started going live, but eventually, it got a little bit too costly, budget cuts, and of course Vince McMahon's legal battle, so they cut back and they went on the road and they started doing it taped. But Nitro would be live. Nitro would be unpredictable. The first ever Monday Nitro in the Mall of America in Minnesota in September of 1995 featured Lex Luger returning to the company after being gone since 1992 and being with the World Wrestling Federation. His push with the World Wrestling Federation failed. He never won the belt from Yokozuna, either at SummerSlam 93 or WrestleMania 10. So he, out of nowhere, unprecedented, unpredictably, he returns to WCW. And the second edition of Monday Nitro is him versus Hulk Hogan. And Monday Nitro is just revolutionary. And then in Memorial Day of 1996, something else unprecedented happens. And that is Scott Hall coming through the audience. Scott Hall, who was just on WWF TV as Razor Ramon, keep in mind, one of the 5 guys that Vince McMahon is pushing as the head of the new generation, is on WCW TV. And he doesn't come out in a traditional way like traditional wrestlers down the aisle. He comes through the audience. Mike Enos, who was in WWF as the Beverly Brothers, and he was in AWA, and the Mauler, as the Mauler, is wrestling Steve Dahl, one of the guys from Well Done, another tag team in 1993 in WWF. In just one of the preliminary opening matches, Enos is managed by Colonel Bob Parker, Ron Fuller, and Scott Hall comes down and he says, "Hey, yo, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here." Basically implying that he is there from the WWF to invade WCW, because Eric Bischoff, since Nitro started, he'd been doing some shady shit. He was giving away the taped results of Raw's TV show. He was telling everybody what was going to happen on Raw so that they wouldn't be able to tune in. They wouldn't have to tune into Raw. They would just tune into Nitro, because embracing China, they would tune into Nitro because they figured Nitro was a live show and Raw is a tape show. So, and WWF had been doing this thing with this billionaire Ted skits, right? Making fun, basically, of WCW for having the old over-the-hill talent like Macho Man and Hulk Hogan and Scheme Gene Okerlund, all guys who 2, 3, 4 years before had been mainstay features on WWF television. So he comes out, he not only references these skits, but he also says, he'd be out there later tonight to get that weatherman wannabe Eric Bischoff, which he does confront Bischoff. He comes out the next week and he confronts Sting. And then the following week, he has Kevin Nash with him. Now, this is Kevin Nash. This is the guy who, several months before, was the WWF champion. He was the face of the new generation going into WrestleMania 11 in 1995. So Eric Bischoff is getting all these people, and then he turns Hulk Hogan heel in January of 96. They formed the New World Order. And they are kicking the WWF's ass in the ratings throughout, for 83 weeks. There's nothing the WWF could do is any good. If you remember watching the WWF at that time, people say Stone Cold Steve Austin was a big deal, and he kind of was, especially when he won the King of the Ring without anybody realizing that he was going to do it. People, if you were watching WWF at that time, you would think that Vader was going to be the guy to win the 1996 King of the Ring. People say that it was booked to be Triple H, but I don't see it. I don't see during the program at that time in mid 1996 that Triple H was supposed to be the guy. But one person who was the guy was Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels in November of 95 was taken out with an injury, forced to give up the IC title in October because he was supposedly beaten up by 5 Marines in Syracuse, New York, which turned out to be a little kayfabe because it was 1 Marine, it wasn't 5, and he suffered a concussion. So they made it into a storyline where the night after Survivor Series that year, in '95, he was wrestling Owen Hart. Owen Hart gives him an enziguri, and then he immediately claps into the ring, and he doesn't come back until the Royal Rumble. He wins the Royal Rumble. In '96, Bret Hart is already the champion. Bret Hart defeated Diesel at Survivor Series '95, and they're on their inevitable clash going into WrestleMania 12. And they have the 60-minute Iron Man match, an unprecedented match for the WWF. And because the WWF in the 80s was known for short matches, short main event matches. They worked that Hulk Hogan style, which was like a punch kick match, and they were very short. They weren't great wrestling matches, but now you had guys like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels that could pull that off. And those two guys did have chemistry going all the way back to 1990 when the Hart Foundation and the Rockers, both guys tag teams, would wrestle each other. And at one point on a Saturday night's main event, the Rockers did defeat the Hart Foundation, but because one of the ropes broke and because of a contract dispute backstage with Jim Neidhart, the decision was reversed. Yeah, embracing China, absolutely, says Austin versus McMahon. Okay, so I'm taking a while to get there. Guys, I just want to give a little bit of the background. But anyway, Shawn Michaels is the number one guy going into for all of '96. But the problem is, he wins the Iron Man match. The boyhood dream comes true. But the problem is, now it's cool. It's cool embracing China. But the problem is, nobody likes him. The guys don't like him. He had a similar problem as Roman Reigns did and John Cena. The women fans like him. The little kid fans like him. But the majority of wrestling fans are 18 to 34 male demographic, and they don't like him. So the way they booked the storyline, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart come up with this backstage, is that they would go to sudden death, and then Gorilla Monsoon, who was returning from kayfabe, being attacked by Vader the night after the Royal Rumble, he comes in and he declares sudden death, and then Bret Hart has to come back in. Bret Hart loses to the super kick, and boom, he leaves the WWF and he pretends like it's real. And him and Shawn Michaels are going back. He's doing articles for the Calgary Sun, and he's really going after Shawn Michaels, basically calling him gay, calling him this, calling him that, calling him degenerate before Degeneration X even is a thing. But Michaels is down with it. Michaels, wants it to be enhance their storyline. But at the same time, here's another thing that happens. Eric Bischoff puts his bid in to get Bret Hart to come to WCW. There are rumors even going back to July of '96 that Bret Hart might have been the third man instead of Hulk Hogan. And that would have made perfect sense. I don't know if the NWO would have been as successful because Hulk Hogan turning heel was the biggest news story in professional wrestling up until that point. But Eric Bischoff is putting his bid in. So he meets with Bret Hart. Bret Hart is asking for an exorbitant amount. Bischoff says he can't do it. So Vince McMahon comes in and he puts his bid in for a 20-year contract with Bret Hart. Now, Bret Hart is already creeping up there in age, and he doesn't, he doesn't have it for that many years. 20 years from 1997, he would have just been getting out his contract a couple of years ago, and in 2017, had that been the case. But there were some, talks with him to work, backstage as an agent or whatever. And Bret Hart decides to sign with WWF again. So Survivor Series 1996, they're going into Madison Square Garden. Austin is on a roll. Austin wins the King of the Ring. Says Austin 316 says, "I just whooped your ass." At first they don't really do anything with him. WWE revisionist history now says, well, he was over the next night, but he really wasn't though, because he was still wrestling Savio Vega, Mark Mero, people like that. It wasn't until this match at Survivor Series 96 with Bret Hart that he really became a star. Double main event. Shawn Michaels is taking on Sid, and Stone Cold Steve Austin is taking on Bret Hart. I was there. It was Madison Square Garden. And Bret Hart wins. Austin has him in the $1 Million Dream. He pushes off against the turnbuckle and he pins Austin for 1, 2, 3. It's an incredible match. And Shawn Michaels also lost to Sid that night. And the fans loved it. The fans loved it when Shawn Michaels lost because they wanted to see a different champion, a more attitude era type champion. Then you fast forward to WrestleMania 13 in Chicago. Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin have a rematch again. It was supposed to be Shawn Michaels versus Bret Hart. What happened in between then? Well, Shawn Michaels wins the WWF Championship again at the San Antonio show in the Royal Rumble of 1997 from Sid. And then he comes on Raw Thursday, and says, "I lost my smile." In other words, I lost my willingness to compete in wrestling. He supposedly said he had a knee injury. He comes out with this sad, somber face, the same sad, somber type face that he did in 1995 when he gave the Intercontinental Championship up to Dean Douglas. He comes out with this again. And all of a sudden now, they put the title up in the Final Four pay-per-view, Vader, Undertaker, Sid and Steve Austin, in which Bret Hart wins. And then the next night on Raw, he loses to Sid again. So going into WrestleMania 13, thanks to help from Steve Austin, going into WrestleMania 13, it was Stone Cold Steve Austin against Bret Hart with Ken Shamrock as the referee. They're bringing in Ken Shamrock from the UFC. He has some contract disputes with the UFC, and plus the UFC is being banned all over the United States thanks to Senator John McCain and his shenanigans. So Ken Shamrock decides to take a payoff and goes back to professional wrestling. He was in professional wrestling in Japan and in the Indies, but he decides to go back. And Bret Hart and Stone Cold, their rematch is a great submission match. They switch roles. They do a double turn. Bret Hart turns heel, at least in the United States, and Stone Cold Steve Austin turns to a babyface because Austin doesn't give up. No matter what, Stone Cold Steve Austin doesn't give up. He's bleeding like a stuffed pig. He's in the sharpshooter, and no matter what, he doesn't give up. He completely passes out. And despite the pay-per-view WrestleMania 13 not doing any real big numbers, still, this is considered by many to be one of the most classic matches in professional wrestling history. So going into the rest of 1997, Bret Hart is on a tremendous heel run. Like he forms the Hart Foundation the night after WrestleMania 13, in which Owen Hart and the British Bulldog are having this match, and Bret Hart comes in and he breaks it up. And finally, since for the first time since 1994, him and Owen Hart are allies again. Owen Hart and him embrace, and they form the Hart Foundation. They later bring in, Brian Pillman was already there, but they bring in Jim the Anvil Neidhart back, and this group is cheered in the UK. They're cheered in Canada. They're baby faces in Canada, but in the United States, they are complete heels. Bret Hart is cutting promos on the United States, talking about the United States healthcare system, talking about how the United States doesn't take care of the sick and the old, really cutting on some deep seated wounds that Canadians really feel about the United States. Canadians feel that they have a better welfare system, a better social safety net than us here in the United States. So a lot of those promos were real promos. And he's talking about how American fans embrace the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels, people that would be considered, heels about 5 or 10 years ago are now considered baby faces now, to the point where Shawn Michaels and Austin even win the tag team championships for Owen Hart and the British Bulldog. Now, and that's in June of 1996. Now, going into the King of the Ring that year, it was supposed to be Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Brian Pillman and Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels, the rematch from WrestleMania 12. But backstage, there was an incident. It was during a promo around that time that Shawn Michaels cut talking about Bret Hart having sunny days. A promo indicating that Bret Hart was having an affair with Sunny, who's Tammy Lynn Cinch, backstage and cheating on his wife. Now, Bret Hart came out later in his book and he said that it was true that he didn't say it was true that he did anything with Sunny, but that it was true that he did cheat on his wife. You know what I mean? He and his wife Julie broke up because of this incident. Not because of this incident, but because of incidents of infidelity on Bret's part. But Bret Hart vehemently denied this, and he and Shawn Michaels got into a scuffle backstage where hair was pulled. Now now I always found this story funny. Jim Cornette talked about it in shoot interviews. Other personalities have talked about it. And Michaels quits the company, says it's an unsafe working environment, and threatens to jump to WCW. And there's even pictures of him in the aftermags, like Pro Wrestling Illustrated, of him holding up the NWO symbol with the Outsiders T-shirt. I always found this funny though because these are professional wrestlers. These are supposed to be fighters, and they have kayfabe, and they're pulling hair. They're pulling hair like they're little second grade schoolgirls. But you guys can't punch. You can't kick. You can't do submission holds. None of that shit. Like you completely expose the business there. But it's becoming clear that Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart cannot be in the same company together. Bret Hart goes to the back after Michaels cut that Sunny Day promo, and he says, "You're fucking with my family. You're fucking with my family." And only because Julie already knew that Bret was cheating on her with other women. So it was believable and it was conceivable that he was doing it with Sunny. Now, the ironic part was that Shawn Michaels later was discovered to be the one that was actually fucking Sunny, behind Chris Candido. Chris Candido's back, Skip from the Body Donnas. During the whole 1995, 1996, Ahmed Johnson was as well. She bloomed for pills. The British Bulldog was. She shared a locker room with Bret Hart, and then later she said she shared a kiss with Bret Hart. Bret Hart has denied this, but anyway, this caused the rift between Hart and Michaels. So now the two biggest guys in the company, they can't work together. They can't have a match together. So the event for King of the Ring 97 is scrapped. They go with the tag team champions of Shawn Michaels and Stone Cold wrestling each other. But again, the main event that we all want to see, the rematch that we all want to see, is pushed to the side. In addition to that, um, Bret Hart tells Shawn Michaels, listen, I'll put you over no matter what. I don't have a problem doing a job to you. And Shawn Michaels says, well, good, because I would never do the same thing for you. So Bret Hart keeps that in mind going into this event that we're about to talk about, Survivor Series 1997. Well, eventually, of course, Vince McMahon does convince Michaels to come back. He doesn't jump to WCW, but he convinced him to come back and become a heel. He and Triple H form DX. Triple H does win the King of the Ring in 97, and he becomes sort of a heel. He scraps the whole blue blood shit that he's been doing since 1995, and they reveal that they were the Clique all along, and they even showed a curtain call on Raw on the Titantron, and they have a match with Mankind, them against Mankind and Undertaker, where Undertaker gets busted open, and then Undertaker and Shawn Michaels have the match at Ground Zero in September, and the first Hell in a Cell match in October that year, and the winner will go on to face Bret Hart, who was again the champion. Shawn Michaels initially turns heel at SummerSlam, where he hits Undertaker with a chair and cost him the championship, and Bret Hart wins it for the fifth time. So now we're going into Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels. Both guys are heels, but we're in Canada. So remember, in Canada, Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation are baby faces. They're Canadian heroes. It's not like in the United States where they're wrestling Vader and the Patriot in a flag match at Bad Blood, and Vader and the Patriot are freaking baby faces. This is Canada, where Bret Hart is a baby face and Michaels is a complete heel. Yeah, he had matches with The Rock at that time, Rocky Maivia, on Raw, where Shawn Michaels was out there. He was shoving the Canadian flag in his nose, wiping his private part in his ass with the Canadian flag, really doing some really disrespectful shit with the Canadian flag. So, of course, going into Montreal, he's going to be looked at as the biggest heel ever in Canada. I mean, was there ever a bigger heel at that point? Now, this is finally the one. This is finally the rematch that we've all been waiting for, months and months in the making. And it's ironic that it wasn't the Survivor Series, because Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels had a tremendous history at the Survivor Series. The first time they ever main evented a pay-per-view, again, like I said, was in Survivor Series 1992. Then in Survivor Series 1993, when Jerry Lawler was fired from the company for alleged rape allegations, Shawn Michaels stepped in with his knights to take on the entire Hart family. So they had history in the Survivor Series. And then a lot of fans, the internet started to come out at that time, and fans were knowing, the Wrestling Observer and stuff like that. Fans were starting to know the inner workings and the backstage drama between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. They knew about it. So going into this, it was like, well, what's going to happen? And fans knew that Vince McMahon reneged on that 20-year deal. He said he couldn't afford it, and he gave Bret Hart an out to go to WCW for a better contract. So fans knew that this was going to be Bret Hart's last match with the company. Some fans knew, some didn't. But the ones that were clued in at that time, I was starting to get into newsletters and the backstage politics of the business at that time. So I was, starting to become, NWO had triggered that for me because it's like, okay, um, these guys made a jump and I didn't know about it and it was exciting, so I wanted to know more and more. And I got the internet at that time, so I was knowing that this was going to be Brett's last match. But fans did not really know how it was going to end. Well, Vince McMahon and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels work out the finish. The finish was supposed to be the DX and the Hart Foundation get into this big brawl, and it's completely thrown out. And the next night, Bret Hart, who was supposed to retain the championship, um, gives it up on Raw. I think it was in Detroit or whatever the next night. But Bret was refusing everything. Every proposal that he'd been given, he was refusing it. He would not do a job to Shawn Michaels. It was completely out of the question. So, in the beginning of the match, one thing that was weird was Vince McMahon comes out. Now, Vince McMahon, up until that point, he'd always been just the announcer. Some people who had paid attention to, say, the local news at the time in 1994, for example, knew that he was the owner because he went to the steroids trial and they knew that he was the owner. But on TV, he'd always been just the announcer. There had been a couple of incidents like when JR turned heel and brought back the fake Razor and Diesel, where he mentioned Vince was the owner. When Jeff Jarrett came back in the middle of '97, he mentioned that Vince was the owner in his promos and in some of his promos. But fans really weren't paying attention all that much. On screen, it had been guys like Jack Tunney, guys like Gorilla Monsoon, and then in the summer of '97, Sergeant Slaughter came in as the commissioner, was reinstated as the commissioner. He'd been in since '92, but they made no mention of it. But it was never revealed that Vince McMahon was the owner. But for this, even the last pay-per-view, Bad Blood, Vince McMahon was on commentary. His famous call when Kane comes out for the first time. It's gotta be Kane. It's gotta be Kane. So something was a little weird. So they're having the match. Then the planned finish comes in. The planned finish was that Bret put Shawn in a sharpshooter, and DX comes out, the Hart Foundation comes out, and it's a schmaz. It's a completely thrown out. But that doesn't happen. Shawn Michaels puts Bret Hart in a sharpshooter, and Vince tells Earl Hebner, ring the fucking bell. And they ring the bell, and Bret Hart never gave up in the sharpshooter. And Shawn Michaels and Triple H, they hightail it out of there. They get out of there. Fans know what's going on. A lot of fans in the Molson Center that night knew what's going on. And Bret signs with his hand in the air quotes, WCW. And he throws the monitor. Now, he had done this shit. He did this shit a lot. Like when he lost the cage match to Sid the night after Final Four in February, he did that and pushed down Vince McMahon. He told him he's sick of this bullshit. He did it after the Royal Rumble when he was eliminated. He eliminated Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Austin came back in, and Austin won the Royal Rumble. So he'd have been doing this on camera for months and months. In fact, Jim Cornette, in his commentary, said, on his commentary on icons in professional wrestling after WCW did Halloween Havoc, and they had a horrible cage match between Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan. He said, he made this Cornette's commentary on icons, and he said, if Bret Hart had been screwed so many times as he claims, he'd have struck oil by now. So this this was something that Bret was doing in kayfabe for months and months. So, and people forget that. People forget that was the basis of Bret Hart's whole heel turn, that he was whiny and that he was a complainer and that he was this, he was that. Turns out Bret Hart is actually that. You know what I mean? That's why his promos in '97 were so good, because that's who Bret Hart is. He is a whiner and a complainer, and he bitches. And he's still bitching about what happened to him at Starrcade '99 with Goldberg. That ended his career. That was a deadly kick, but they were doing nothing with him when he goes to WCW anyway. But And then that is the birth of the Mr. McMahon character, especially the night after when JR does a sit down with him and basically says, um, I didn't screw Bret Hart. Bret Hart screwed Bret Hart. And fans were like, what the fuck? This guy, you know, they knew that Vince McMahon changed the finish on Bret Hart because they had done a documentary with Jay Paul, the Canadian reporter, called Hitman Hart Wrestling with Shadows, which premiered with A&E that year. It was supposed to premiere on the Turner stations, but Vince McMahon had it blocked and it premiered on Turner, and it was one of the greatest wrestling documentaries ever produced. And it was about the life of Bret Hart and the goings on with this event. So fans had already known that that was going to be the finish because there's a scene in the documentary where they show Vince McMahon and Bret Hart talking about what the finish was supposed to be. So that immediately turns Bret into the biggest babyface of all time. And of course, what does WCW do? They come in, and months later, they turn him heel to the NWO Black and White. And the very event he comes in, so Starrcade '97, he looks like he screwed Hulk Hogan out of the championship. Hulk Hogan wins it clean. It was supposed to be a fast count. Nick Patrick doesn't count fast, he counts normal. And then Bret Hart comes in, says this is not happening again, punches Nick Patrick, and restarts the match, and that's how Sting wins. So Sting looks like the heel rather than the baby face, and it looks like, oh shit, Hulk Hogan got screwed too. You know, and then they turn him into a heel months later when he cost Randy Savage the championship, and he becomes a member or an associate of the NWO Black and White. But that's another story altogether. To Big Dog's point, Austin versus McMahon and The Rock's great mic skills helped save the WWF, but many argue that the Montreal Screwjob fueled McMahon to become the ruthless heel. Yes, that is the case. I agree with that because it was perfect because just like when Bob Bank in 1984 when Bob Backlund lost the championship to the Iron Sheik because Arnold Scullin threw in the towel. Okay, it's like in the minds of the fans, the Iron Sheik cheated. The Iron Sheik really didn't win. The Iron Sheik needs to get his ass kicked. So what happens a couple months later? Hulk Hogan comes in, and Hulk Hogan gets the revenge on this ruthless heel, the Iron Sheik. Just like that, it was like that with this. Vince McMahon did something dastardly. Vince McMahon fucked up the entire kayfabe universe of the WWF. He screwed Bret Hart. So who better than the old adversary of Bret Hart, the man who, despite them having their ups and downs, had a begrudging respect for Stone Cold Steve Austin. Despite them having a legendary rivalry, Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin had this respect. So Vince McMahon does this dastardly deed. Vince McMahon's ass needs to pay. So it was Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was perfect storytelling. And it kind of wrote itself. Vince McMahon needs his ass kicked because he screwed Bret Hart. He not only screwed Bret Hart, but he kicked Davey Boy Smith and Jim the Anvil Neidhart out of the company, and he wouldn't give Owen Hart his just due. He wouldn't even give Owen Hart a match with Shawn Michaels, to avenge the loss of his, the disgrace that was put upon his family by Vince McMahon. So their old adversary had to put his hatred of the Hart family and the Hart Foundation aside out of a begrudging respect to take on Vince McMahon. So, and to beat Shawn Michaels for the championship at WrestleMania 14. So, absolutely, I agree with that being the reason why Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Vince McMahon got over the hill. because it's like Vince McMahon needs to be stopped. Somebody needs to put a stop to Vince McMahon. Just like I said, when the Iron Sheik beat Backlund, it was like somebody needs to put the Iron Sheik to rest, and Hulk Hogan was able to come in and do that, and that started Hulkamania. So just like this, there was nobody else that was going to be that heel, that authority figure, because the '90s was all about bucking authority, and you notice Stone Cold Steve Austin earned the respect of the Canadian fans after Bret Hart left, despite him having the feud with Bret Hart, because he was the one who basically avenged Bret. He got Bret's revenge by beating up not only Vince McMahon, but also DX. As far as The Rock's mic skills, yeah, that was one of the big things, but that wasn't until a year later, really, you know, when Vince Russo turned this whole screw job shit into a storyline. He then um, he screwed Stone Cold Steve Austin by Shane being a referee, and he double screwed Mankind, who Vince had set up as his guy after WrestleMania 14, his wrestler's chosen wrestler after WrestleMania 14 to beat Stone Cold Steve Austin, and then the corporation screws him, and they go with The Rock as the corporate champion. That's one of the best piece of businesses that Vince Russo ever did, perhaps the best. But absolutely, making Vince McMahon the heel was perfect. Vince had done some shit like that in '93 in Memphis, where it was an interpromotional war between WWF guys and Memphis guys. Owen Hart went down for that. Bret Hart went down for that. Macho Man. But most fans didn't see that. You know what I mean? So this was the first time that we saw the heel Vince McMahon, this asshole Vince McMahon, finally being the asshole that we all grew to know and love. So Montreal turned the corner. It was Montreal and WCW's misuse of Bret Hart after he came in that is why we're talking about the WWE today and not WCW. That was the turning point for WWE. It was the perfect heel. All wrestling rivalries are built on great heels and great baby faces. If you don't have the Midnight Express, then the Rock and Roll Express wouldn't be as popular. If you didn't have the Freebirds, then the JYD wouldn't be as popular. If you didn't have the Von Erichs, then the Freebirds wouldn't be as popular. And if you didn't have Austin, if you didn't have McMahon, Austin wouldn't have been as popular. Because for the entire Attitude Era, the whole storyline was Vince aligns himself with a certain wrestler, be it Undertaker, be it The Rock, be it Mankind, be it Dude Love, whoever, and he used that wrestler to go after Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was a tried and true formula that they'd been using in the WWF forever. They used it with Captain Lou Albano and Bruno Sammartino in the 60s and 70s. They used it in the 80s when Hulk Hogan and Bobby Heenan came over. The Heenan family members like King Kong Bundy and Andre the Giant had gone after Hulk Hogan and tried on behalf of Bobby Heenan to get the belt from Hogan. But this had a different twist with it because of what Vince had done at Montreal. He done something real. This was the first time ever on television. We talked about before the curtain call, them breaking kayfabe, but that was in a house show. Nobody saw that. You know what I mean? This was something that everybody saw. This was not implied like the Scott Hall coming over to WCW thing was an implication that he was coming on behalf of WWF to WCW. This was stated. You know what I mean? This was spelled out clearly. They actually talked about WCW contract negotiations, backstage stuff in ways that they never talked about it ever in the WWF. In fact, WWF in those days, all throughout the 80s and all throughout the 90s before the Montreal Screwjob, they rarely, if ever, besides the Billionaire Ted skits, even acknowledged that there was such a thing as WCW. They wanted you to believe They made it out to seem that all other wrestling promotions did not exist, and if they did, they didn't matter. You know what I mean? Like when a wrestler left, a popular wrestler left, he just left. Either that or they belittled him, made fun of him, and they mocked him. You know, but they didn't say, "Oh well, he went to WCW or he went to ECW." They mentioned ECW kind of because they had a working relationship with ECW, but even that didn't start until '97. Before that, WWE never mentioned other promotions besides like USWA and Smoky Mountain, which people didn't, people on a national level. But WCW, NWA, they never mentioned they existed. They never talked about contract negotiations or any of that shit on television in a major way, in a major storyline. And most certainly, they never acknowledged that people knew beforehand that on TV anyway. Yeah, in 1989 to whenever the New Jersey government, Vince McMahon admitted that wrestling was a work, but that was, you know, that was behind the scenes. That wasn't on TV. This was the first time ever that they acknowledged that, yeah, somebody knows who's going to win and lose in wrestling. Ever. Ever. Like this is how historic this was. This was the day that wrestling changed forever. I mean, there was no going back. There was no more kayfabe. We all knew the cat was out of the bag at this point. We all kind of knew, but this was confirmation to us all that yes, wrestling can never pull the wool over our eyes again and pretend that it is a legitimate sport and that winners and losers are determined by pure athletic ability again because it was over. You know what I mean? After the Montreal Screwjob, that was it. You know what I mean? We all knew, the top was completely blown off. Now, wrestling then took on a metatextual um, presentation at that point, to the point where the inner workings of the business became interwoven with the storylines. You know what I mean? Vince and the other on-screen authority heel figures, even the GMs later on, would talk about contracts and they would talk about being fired and they would talk about this and that. Things they didn't, it wasn't just, okay, he's going to screw him out of a title shot or he's going to screw him out of a title or he's going to screw him out of this. He's going to screw him out of his whole career. He's going to manipulate backstage to do certain shit. So it was a turning point embracing China. Um, you know, on what wrestling was to now to the point I think in 2022 it's like it's tiring by now. We don't want to see it. We don't want to hear about this kind of heel authority figure doing backstage manipulations to fire a wrestler to do this and that and screw a wrestler. How many times has the Montreal Screwjob been replicated on television? You know what I mean? We're sick and tired of seeing these heel authority figure type storylines. I think they need to go back to the drawing board and go back to the late 80s and early 90s when they did pretend that it was about pure athleticism. I don't know if they can because it's too far gone by now. You know what I mean? That taboo has already been broken. But still, this whole heel authority figure, this is all played out by now. But it was new then. It was different then. Sure, Eric Bischoff had done it with the NWO, and it was kind of there, but it wasn't to this level. You know what I mean? Bischoff did it first, but something about this, it felt different. It felt real in a sense because it was. Now, since that time, there have been uh, you know, speculations. Wrestlers are the ultimate conspiracy theorists because wrestlers exist in a world where nothing is real, everything is a work, everything is a lie, everything is a manipulation. They exist in a parallel universe where lying really isn't lying, lying is working. You know what I mean? So they think everything is a con, everything is some sort of way to get over on a person psychologically. So some wrestlers, including the late Scott Hall, have suggested that the whole Montreal Screwjob was a work, and this has sort of become like the Kennedy assassination of professional wrestling. Everybody has their theory. Even Earl Hebner suggested it may have been a work because all parties benefit. I mean, Bret Hart didn't really benefit um, in a sense in a career success in a sense in which his career benefited, not in a creative sense because he went to WCW and they dropped the ball, but he benefited financially. You know what I mean? He um he got a really lucrative deal with WCW and he did become a multimillionaire. WWF benefited because they used the steam from that storyline to propel them to the Attitude Era and like embracing China. Brought up, you know, Stone Cold Steve Austin stepped in Bret Hart's place as the heel to take on Vince McMahon. So they all benefited, and inevitably, WWE won the war, the Monday Night War, from um, off the strength and the scheme of this storyline. So it looks like all parties involved benefited. I guess Shawn Michaels didn't really benefit though. You know what I mean? For years, Shawn Michaels claimed that he didn't know about he wasn't in on the Montreal Screwjob. He said that to Bret's face. And then in 2002 on the WWE's Confidential show, he then admits that he was involved. And all this time, he knew all along that it was he and Triple H who had the discussion to screw Bret Hart. Now, this was not the first screw job that Vince had ever done. Back in the 1980s, when Wendy Richter didn't want to drop the belt to the Fabulous Moolah, um, Wendy Richter had a match with the Spider Lady. The Spider Lady gets her in a small package, and she pins her for real. And then Wendy Richter actually loses the championship. This was 1984, coming off of Wendy Richter being the hottest female star in the company and being linked to Cyndi Lauper and starting the Rock and Wrestling connection. Vince doesn't want to pay her, so he puts the belt back on Moolah. That was the first screw job ever in the WWF, at least. There have been other ones, back in the day in the NWA and the AWA. This is why all wrestling promotions had these real wrestlers that knew these catch holds, these catch maneuvers, and amateur maneuvers and amateur pinfall situations. They had them as what they call policemen, because in case another wrestler didn't want to do business, they could either snatch on a real hold on them or snatch on a real pinfall combination on them and actually beat them in real life. You know what I mean? But in modern professional wrestling, that was never really needed. That was never really done. But guys like Jim Cornette, for example, they knew about this happening in the territory days, and they brought it up. And that's another thing. Everybody always, since the Montreal Screwjob, everybody takes credit for the Montreal Screwjob. Everybody says that they were the guy to say, well, if Bret Hart doesn't want to do business, just screw him. Screw him out of the championship. Everybody, Russo, everybody, like this is the most talked about piece of wrestling lore in history, even more so than the Chris Benoit double murder suicide. This is the thing that everybody talks about. If you know anything about wrestling in that time period, you know the Montreal Screwjob. This and Hulk Hogan slamming Andre the Giant is something about wrestling history that even a person who's who was only a casual observer of wrestling will know of the story of this. Because of the animosity, the real life animosity between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels and what became of it, what was birthed from it, the Attitude Era. Now, one thing that people always fail to mention, people always say, well, how can Bret Hart say that he was the Canadian hero? How can he say that he was the Canadian hero? It was just, it's kayfabe, it's wrestling, it's not real. He wasn't never really a Canadian hero. But you got to remember, and this is when politics and social history of Canada and the United States kind of ties in. Um, Canadian celebrities, people love a celebrity from Canada. The Canadian people attach themselves to a Canadian celebrity because, in comparison to the United States, some Canadians feel kind of inferior. You know what I mean? The United States has all this military history, all this social history, has this huge impact on the world. Is a great superpower, almost as the same age as Canada, for example, both from the same continent, both Western democracies. But the United States has a history of influencing other parts of the world where Canada really doesn't. They have a relationship like a little brother and a big brother, like kind of Bret Hart and Owen Hart. And Canada is like Owen Hart. Canada is in the shadow of the United States. So when Canada gets these celebrities like a Celine Dion, like a Wayne Gretzky, like a Bret Hart, they attach themselves to them um, very ferociously, unlike American celebrities, because celebrities for us are a dime a dozen. We built the Hollywood system. We have the Hollywood system, so we don't have that inferiority complex that Canada has. Canada does, and JJ McCulloch, who is a Canadian YouTuber that does histories on Canadian political history, he talks about this, how Canadian nationalism is attached to being anti-American. The more anti-American one in Canada is, the more pro-Canadian nationalist they are. Because the one thing they can say about themselves and their history is that they aren't American. You know what I mean? So when they do have these celebrities, they big them up. And when they do have differences that they see as more politically progressive, they attach themselves to those causes, such as universal health care or legalization of marijuana or being more progressive in general. And we saw this in the latter half of 2010 when both Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau came in. It was like American liberals love to champion Canada as the bastion of liberalism, everything the United States isn't. So they define themselves in the national character as completely opposite of America. So whereas America is redneck, America is backwards, America is dangerously conservative, Canada isn't. So it's entirely conceivable that Canadians would attach themselves to Bret Hart like he was a Canadian hero, because even though it was kayfabe, even though it was wrestling, still he was fighting for them. He was fighting on their behalf. He was fighting, against big bad America, big bad imperialistic America, big bad conservative, big bad redneck America. Especially his two main adversaries were Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels, two guys from Texas, the most politically opposite you can get from the left-leaning Canada. Like if there were two places in North America that were completely politically diametrically um, diametrically opposed, it would be the liberal parts of Canada, what they call the Laurentian elite, places of Canada, the eastern half of Canada, like Montreal and Texas. But ironically, Montreal, and this is something that people don't bring up either, Montreal has had its issues, and even did in the 90s, with um, Quebecois or French Canadian separatism. In 1995, they issued a referendum which barely passed, like 49 to 50%, in which um, Montreal and the whole province of Quebec almost became its own separate country. Of course, WWF has alluded to this, um, in their storylines in the past. This is why Quebec, um, French Canadian or Quebecois characters in the WWF have been always they've been heels, like Dino Bravo, like the Quebecers, for example. They've always been heels because during this era of the late '80s and early '90s, this was the era of hard French Canadian separatism. So for Bret Hart, a guy from Western Canada, which he's from Alberta, and it's more politically conservative, it's more aligned to like the politics of the United States, to be hailed as a hero and being a man of Anglo-Canadian descent in Montreal was like a unifying effect for the country. It'd be kind of like if in the United States, for example, during the 1960s, a black star was like even going back further than the 60s. Take, for example, the 1938 match between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. The fact that Joe Louis, in even southern states like Alabama and Mississippi, was hailed as a hero, an American hero in the eyes of the entire public, even some pro-segregationist conservatives at that time, was a monumental feat. Even though he was just a boxer, even though he was just a sports athlete, he was taking on the mantle of America against the Germans. So that's kind of like, and he was a unifying figure in the American consciousness. So that's kind of like how Bret Hart was viewed in the Canadian consciousness. Even though he was just a wrestler, even though he was just a celebrity, he was seen as taking on the establishment of the American political dominance and American hegemony, and as a unifying figure between different political factions within Canada. So they couldn't agree on mostly anything, English speaking Canada and French speaking Canada, but they could agree on when they sat down at their TV in front of their TV sets during 1997 that Bret Hart was the Canadian hero, just like um, Joe Louis was the American hero during World War II. It seems pretty weird, but this has happened before. Look at the Olympics in the 1980s when um, America took on the Soviet Union. You know what I mean? Even Ludwig Borga, a guy who wasn't even really pushed in the WWF in 1993, was taken in as a figure of a national figure, a national hero in his country of Finland, just for representing Finland, just for being on American television from Finland. You know what I mean? So imagine how much more amplified it was in Canada when they're just going to this political crisis of their country completely being torn apart with ethnic tension, to have this unifying figure of Bret Hart, championing Canadian nationalism and going against the Americans. It's even though he's from the other side, even though he's an Anglo-Canadian, he's from a conservative province, it's still monumental in the eyes of Canadians. Because here they have somebody finally saying what they wish they could say if they had the opportunity and the forum to say it. Just like Ricky Dozan was in Japan after World War II, we talked about it, and Antonio Inoki was after World War II in Japan, taking on the Gaijin, the American talent, like Lou Thez, carrying the Japanese flag in the face of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's a part, the whole French and English Canadian tensions that people don't really touch on. And that's, to me, in my opinion, why Bret Hart was championed as such a national hero and a national figure that they don't really touch on, that, that occurred to me. And again, that's why Stone Cold Steve Austin worked so well, as the foil to Bret Hart, because again, take Quebec and take Texas, no two places in North America are more politically um, diametrically opposed, at least at that time, which Quebec has always been left leaning. Now there's a lot of conservatives in a lot of conservative people in Quebec, like Stephen Crowder, for example. But in the '90s, they they were the most left wing. I would say the most left wing place in North America, even more left wing than places like New York or California. And Texas was the most right wing. And both places have separatist movements based on their political ideology. So it worked perfectly. And then it also worked again because of the tension between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart that was in real life. And it just had so many layers and so many dimensions to it. And the whole Vince McMahon thing, a lot of fans, it's crazy because it would have worked in the South in the American South as well, because they never liked Vince either. You know, they still haven't. A lot of them still haven't even gotten over the Civil War, and they kind of project their political feelings on to wrestling as well. They're like, oh, they beat us once in in the 1860s, and they beat us again in the 1980s when Vince took out all the Southern territories. That's why they didn't support him when Vince bought World Championship Wrestling, which was then Georgia Championship Wrestling, for the first time in 1984. And Black Saturday led to wrestling almost being canceled and Jim Crockett having to step in and buy the company from Vince. You know what I mean? So it would have worked. Him being a heel would have worked in the American South as well on a semi political basis for a different reason. You know what I mean? Because he would have been looked at as the big bad Yankee trying to take over the South again, kind of like uh, a General Sherman, but in the squared circle. You know. Um, yeah. So embracing China. What's up, bro? Sorry that was long winded, but I don't know uh, what you want to add to this conversation. What you want to add to what I'm saying. Were you watching? Um, and ironically, one of the biggest. You're welcome, man. One of the biggest French Canadian nationalists was named Levesque, the biggest French Canadian nationalist in the '90s. His last name was Levesque. So how about that? Yeah. Oh no, no, it's cool. You know, we we all got to be on our top G shit. How's it with Chinese? All right, it's cool, man. How is it with uh, the uh, the Chinese uh, the Chinese dating market? Are they really as submissive as uh, Western men say they are, or are they more subversive, submissive, in a sense that they make you feel as if you are the head of the table, but they're the neck that turns the head. That's what I always hear about East Asian East Asian chicks that they. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Small town, um, small town places tend to be um, more conservative around the world, except for again Canada. Jerry Lawler used to say that Canada was the bizarro world. It's like that in wrestling, but it's also very much like that in politics, in which rural areas tend to be more nationalistic and more liberal, it seems like, than, you know, greater, you know, big cities with a more educated elite. Again, it's changing, but Canada is weird. But China, I could see that. China, they're more into their traditional culture of Taoism and Confucian. Oh wow. Okay, wow. Yeah, I could see that though. But Chinese have always been the Chinese society. Like we talked about before, has always been the type of society that even when foreigners come in, uh, and they adopt foreign ideologies, they sinuize it. They make it Chinese. So they want to use Chinese social media in the credit system more than American social media, like YouTube, Facebook, or whatever. You know what I mean? They'll take the technology, but they won't take the company itself. You know what I mean? They'll make it their own. Just like, for example, they took communism and they made like a Chinese version, Maoism of communism. They took Buddhism, but they made like Chan Buddhism or Chinese versions of Buddhism rather than the traditional like Indian version of Buddhism. So even with modern technology, we see with Huawei, that company, they take that, but they don't, they'll take the good parts and they'll leave what they perceive as the bad parts. China has always really been that. And that's been the enigma behind China, the mystery behind China in the Western world. You know what I mean? It's one of the reasons, like I always wondered, like tying it back into wrestling, I always wondered why wrestling never really caught on in China in the same way it did in Japan. Because and then I figured it out. Well, one is because since 1949 they've been closed off to to really Western and American culture. Even though they were open in the 70s politically, still they were kind of closed off. But it took all over. It took off in Japan. You know what I mean? Like I always wondered that when I was a kid. I was like, yeah, there's all these Japanese wrestlers and this huge culture around pro wrestling in Japan, but nothing in China. And the Chinese martial arts, like Kung Fu, um, you know, go back further than the Japanese martial arts, like karate and jiu-jitsu. Embracing China says China is becoming so closed off again. Yeah, yeah, because again, and we talked about this in a lot of other videos, where when things become harder, countries close ranks, and countries, when economics becomes harder, or when there's pandemics, or when there's hardships, people go people go back to what works, and they go back to their traditional systems of conservatism. We're seeing it here in the United States, where conservatism has taken a further root, especially more than it was, say, during the Obama administration, or especially during this time period that we're talking about in 1997, where Bill Clinton was the president. It was economic and social liberalism run amok. That was one of the things that laid the groundwork, I feel, for the triumph of the Attitude Era and the social, socially libertine things that we saw in 90s television, not just in wrestling, but in Beavis and Butthead, South Park, gangster rap music, grunge music, all that stuff in the 90s. But by the 2000s, especially when the Bush administration and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, things became conservative, more conservative, and WWE became more conservative. And they had the pro American John Cena on there. And then, you know, the Obama administration, everything became more liberalized, the rise of MMA, the rise of this ultra violent reality TV show era. And then now, because things are becoming economically more difficult, conservatism is again on the rise in the Western world. That and immigration. So what embracing China is saying with oh wow, he's saying we do these nucleic acid tests almost daily here. It's out of control. Um, but I think embracing China, that China is not only concerned with the West, but also you got enemies on both sides in a sense. You have the enemies of the West, which they perceive as enemies of the West, and its allies like Japan, which is basically like a Western outpost in East Asia. But you also have North Korea, which I don't know what is really the specifics. I'm not really an expert. I pay attention to, um, you know, political goings on in the world, but China and its relationships to other East Asian nations is hard for a Westerner to gauge because, it's not like Chinese embracing China would know better. It's not like Chinese news is, um, readily available. It's kind of like professional wrestling news or insider news was, prior to this event that we're talking about, where it's closed in and you would have to be in the know to really know about it. So I don't know what is their relationship to North Korea, and maybe they perceive North Korean enemies on one side and Western enemies on the other side, so they feel as though they're completely sandwiched in, completely walled in, which puts China in a similar position as they were before, they built the wall of China, which is why they built the wall of China. You know, and then you have the wild card of Hong Kong, which is like a Western outpost in a sense. You have Taiwan, of course, an American outpost, and um, and Americans especially, always threatening to China even makes a move on Taiwan. Like if they even move one little piece of the chessboard, that they're going to do something. They're kind of like Eric Bischoff was in late 1996. If Vince even farts in his direction, he's going to do something. You know what I mean? So there's that. And then you have a situation in the west of China. It'd be like if instead of Tom Brady, the biggest draw in football was fucking some some guy. It'd be like instead of LeBron, if Bill Murray was the actual biggest draw in the NBA. Remember when Bill Murray would have those fake press conferences on those NBA commercials in the 90s saying that he's teasing that he was going to come into the NBA, and he does that cameo in Space Jam in 96. It'd be like if Bill Murray was the biggest face in the NBA right now, rather than LeBron, rather than um, Kevin Durant. You know, it's a complete joke, and it makes a mockery of the business of professional wrestling and the sport of boxing. That these two guys, they're not even tough guys. They're not even um, Geno Smith. You know, uh, they're not even tough. You know what I mean? They're not even fake tough. They're not even fake tough like Mr. T. Mr. T, yeah, he was an actor and he was probably a punk. You know what I mean? Because he got scared that Orndorff and Piper were gonna shoot on him in WrestleMania 1. You know what I mean? But still, he looked tough. You know, when he did Rocky 3 in 1982, he looked tough. You know what I mean? So these guys don't even look tough. These guys don't even appear tough. These guys don't even give off the facade of being anybody that can whoop other people's asses. And you know it's true because it's it's the fruit, embracing China, of what the Montreal Screwjob produced. The Montreal Screwjob killed kayfabe forever, and it got us into the role where we no longer care. It's no longer a big deal. It's no longer a big issue that a jabroni like Logan Paul could be challenging for a title. Mm. Like before Montreal, before kayfabe was completely dead. I mean, yes, Lawrence Taylor wrestled Bam Bam Bigelow at WrestleMania 11, but Lawrence Taylor was a world class athlete. There was no way that even with Mr. T, with the facade that he had, that he was tough, that they were going to allow Mr. T to wrestle even in the main event by himself. It was That was never conceivable in the 80s, the 90s, the 60s or 70s in professional wrestling. That completely destroyed the credibility of wrestling because again, and I mentioned this on my old channel. I think I'll transfer the old video that I did on wrestling territory to this channel. If Mr. T comes in and he beats the wrestlers and he beats the ass of all the wrestlers, he's a TV actor, that makes wrestling look like these guys were never tough. You know what I mean? That's why I look at like the fight story. We talked about it earlier between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels pulling hair. That makes wrestling look like this is some pussy shit. Like this is some this is a joke. You know what I mean? And that's exactly what Logan Paul, being a contender for not one world championships, not one world championship, both world championships, and beating the guy who has been on an absolute tear. Yeah, that's true too. The funny part, and and I never made a video on the AEW situation with CM Punk because again, that whole backstage incident with CM Punk getting into it with Kenny Omega and the Bucks, that makes wrestling look completely stupid as well because here you have CM Punk, a motherfucker that was beaten up by Mike Jackson and Mickey Gall in two attempts to step into the octagon with those guys. He still is able to beat the ass of Omega and the Bucks. Like the jobber of jobbers in MMA is still able to beat up two guys. So after Montreal, wrestling doesn't care anymore. Like, oh, well, people know it's fake. People know it's all bullshit. We'll just do whatever now. Like, there's no they're not even trying anymore. They're not even pretending to pretend. You know, all bets are off, and it's like now you can't take the matches serious. You know. I mean, yes, Logan Paul was booked correctly, booked the way a fighting babyface should be booked, but it's Logan fucking Paul. It's not Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13, where Austin doesn't win, but he looks credible, and it gives him sort of an out. Like people are comparing it to that. You know, people are saying, well, this is kind of like WrestleMania 13, where Austin, fought with all his heart and he didn't win, but he still kind of won over the hearts of the people. Yeah, but he was Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is Logan Paul. Like, Roman Reigns should have obliterated him like he was fucking Gilbert, and he would have in the olden days. But you can't compare it to the olden days. You can't. You got to know that wrestlers don't even care. This is why Jim Cornette is looked at as such a joke by modern fans and people in industry because he's trying to hold on to any semblance of realism when everybody else has let that go for a long period of time. Fans have let it go, wrestlers have let it go, bookers have let it go. It's something different now. It's not even a fake sport. It's like a dance, like a performing art. It's like figure skating. People, well, okay, it's just bullshit to wrestling. Who really cares anymore? You know what I mean? And then you got a guy like Cornette that's trying to hold on to some of the old ways, trying to say, well, this is what still works. This is what's still believable. But fans don't give a shit anymore. And Montreal opened the doors for that. But now it's like, oh, what have we done? Now we're looking at it like Charlton Heston was looking at the Statue of Liberty at the end of Planet of the Apes. And Charlton Heston is Jim Cornette of this situation. Charlton Heston is the fans in that situation. It's like, they blew it up! God damn them all! you know, they completely destroyed wrestling. And the start of their decline was Montreal. It seemed like it was the start of the biggest boom era, and it was, but it was also the beginning of the end for wrestling as we knew it, as we'd grown to love it. You know what I mean? So it was a gift and a curse, in a sense, Montreal, because without kayfabe, wrestling doesn't work. There was a reason why they had kayfabe for all those years. There was a reason why they fought like hell, sometimes literally, to protect kayfabe. And it was because without it, it fades away. It's like the Soviet Union when they opened the door. Again, going back to our earlier discussion, when they opened the door with perestroika and glasnost, when they liberalized economically. Once they did that, they opened up the door for the whole shit to fall, the whole house of cards. So the house of cards of wrestling was built on kayfabe. Without kayfabe, it's like Jenga. You remove that one block, boom, it all falls apart. And that's exactly what happened in the Montreal Screwjob. It was good for a while, but like a cocaine addict, we crashed on it. It was so good that you can't top it, and it destroyed the industry. It killed professional wrestling. Without kayfabe, there is no professional wrestling. There's something different. There's something that's not as good. There's something that is a complete joke, a complete laughing stock. It's without kayfabe, wrestling is the American Gladiators. You know, something that people might enjoy, people might like, people might look at to laugh at, people might look at to mock, but people will never look at it to take it serious. People will never look at it to become emotionally invested in it like they did with the Von Erichs or the Freebirds or Bruno Sammartino and Stan Hansen or the JYD with the Freebirds or Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giants. They'll never look at it in a serious way. They'll look at it like, okay, there goes Sorbo from the American Gladiator, so something to or that Chinese stunt program. I mean, that Japanese stunt program that used to come up with English overdubbed subtitles that people used to laugh at. That was on TNN for a while, or monster truck rallies. Okay, it's something we see for a while, but nobody takes it seriously. It's just there. There goes Logan Paul, competing against Roman Reigns. I know a guy off the street, a complete jabroni, challenging for um, your two world championships, beating up your champion, beating up the guy who's been your main star since at least 2015. You know, he's taking over now. He's about to win the championship. He's made to look credible. They did the right thing with him in terms of booking, but the wrong guy. You know what I mean? And boxing did it too because boxing introduced him first. Boxing gave him the platform to do it first. He fought Mayweather before he was in WWE. You know what I mean? So boxing, the sport that used to make fun of professional wrestling, used to always laugh at professional wrestling. Now they're doing the same shit. You know what I mean? So, hey, welcome to the party. You know, it's boxing has become like that prudish girl. She was a prude in high school, but then when you see her, in college or in adulthood, now she's a slut. And the girl that was always slutty, she's a ran through crack whore, you know. And she's looking at the formerly prudish girl, and she's like, well, what do we have here? So that's kind of like wrestling is looking at boxing. Like, don't moralize to me, don't get on your soapbox to me because you're doing the same cheap promotional tactics that you always hated us for over a century for doing. You're doing the exact same thing. You introduced Logan Paul to the world. You introduced the Paul brothers to the world. You're still putting Jake Paul out there to have these bullshit matches with Anderson Silva and Tyron Woodley. That's your sport. That's your prestige. That's your reputability. Your shit is down the drain just like our shit. Our shit is worse because our shit people never took serious or people took semi-serious. Now they don't take it serious at all. And your shit, they don't take serious either in terms of boxing. So both sports are down the drain now. MMA is the only one with still a shred of respectability. MMA doesn't engage in this. I mean, yeah, they had James Toney. They brought in CM Punk for a while, but they ain't bringing them motherfuckers off social media. That's for sure. You know what I mean? Like boxing and wrestling um, are doing and have done. And when I say wrestling, it's just WWE. AEW is not even on people's radar. That shit is a complete laughing stock. I mean, that's just, if you ask me, that's just a way that Tony Khan's father makes Tony feel important, or a way to finance, you know, Tony Khan's you know drug-induced fantasies of being a professional wrestling booker to surround himself with his buddies. And Shad Khan will get tired of it. His father. Yeah, he'll get tired. Shad Khan looks like Saddam Hussein. He looks like every Middle Eastern dictator that I've ever seen. Big ass mustache. Like he looks like Saddam when they caught him out of his hole. You know what I mean? Tony Khan's father. And Tony Khan looks like Rick Moranis. You know what I mean? Rather than uh, rather than running a wrestling promotion, you would think that his pet project was some contraption that shrinks his kids. Um, Instead of Honey I Shrunk the Kids, Honey I created a wrestling promotion, or Honey I Shrunk the Wrestlers. You know how about that? Because you certainly did shrink the wrestlers. Look at your average size of an AEW top performer compared to your average size of a WCW. Suddenly Seymour, suddenly Tony, suddenly CM Punk. you know, and you know, and people wanted to believe in AEW. People wanted to believe, um, that AEW was going to do well. You know what I mean? Because they remember the Attitude Era. They remember what it was like switching between TNT and USA Network on Monday nights, and how excited you were to see what each promotion was going to do. And they thought that it was going to be the same way. They thought that in 2010 too, when TNA came in for like their week of competing with WWE, and they threw Hulk Hogan in there. They threw Jeff Hardy in there, Rob Van Dam in there, and Jeff Hardy was the only one relevant at the time. But of course, Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan just ran through that company, took all of Dixie Carter's money, changed the shape of the ring, and then left. And Hogan went back to WWE a couple of years later. You know what I mean? It was a money pit for them. Hulk Hogan's magical dust no longer worked. It worked in AWA, it worked in WWE, and it worked in WCW, but it didn't work in TNA and backfired because nobody cared anymore. And ironically, remember that was the same night that Bret Hart in 2010 returned to WWE for the first time and made peace with Shawn Michaels and begin that storyline with Vince that will culminate in their Street Fighter. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. It's you, big dog. Yeah, I know it's you. Um, I broke kayfabe a couple of times, referring to you as big dog because I knew it was you. you know, um, it's kind of like back in the day when you would hear a wrestler referred to another wrestler by a previous gimmick name, and you'd be like, "Oh shit!" You know, he actually mentioned it. You know what I mean? Like in '98 when Ultimate Warrior came out and referenced the disciple as the barber. And like we already knew, but he's just confirming it. But yeah, that was the night Brett came back 2010. The feud with Vince didn't go anywhere. I felt like because after Brett had his stroke, he couldn't do anything. in the match at WrestleMania 26, and plus it had been too long. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, they kept talking about the screw job, they kept referencing it, but 1997, 2010, it had no impact, and plus the match sucked. I thought that rather than them have a match, this is what I thought at the time, and I still think this would have worked better than Vince and Brett having a match because Brett couldn't take bumps. They were having the Batista versus the Batista versus John Cena program. You could have had Vince in Batista's corner and Bret Hart in John Cena's corner, and they could have had a confrontation like Vince and Trump did at 23, rather than uh, having Vince. Yeah, yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Yeah, the night, um, the night after the nitro after Montreal, I remember the NWO coming out with all the flags, all the Canadian flags. The NWO came out at the beginning of every nitro, but they came out with all the flags, like a bunch of Canadian flags, and they welcomed Bret Hart into the company. And I was like, okay, this has potential because he could do what DDP did, refuse the NWO's offer, and then turn against Hogan and build up from Starrcade 97. You have Sting go over clean, right? You don't have that screwy finish they had because Bischoff said Sting didn't tan or Sting wasn't tan enough. What is like racism in reverse now? Sting is too white to win a championship. you know, you know what I mean? What the hell does that mean? He's not tan. Like, so what? Like, who cares? Who cares? So, what you do is you build to Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart. That match WWE never gave you. The match that we knew there was heat between them. Because again, people were just getting into the dirt sheets at that time. And we knew how Bret felt about what happened at WrestleMania 9, you know, and he felt usurped by Hogan. And WWE never did anything with it because Hogan didn't want to do it. He felt Bret was beneath him, but he still felt Bret was beneath him, when he came to WCW. So, yeah, Bret's first job was the referee between Larry Zbyszko and Eric Bischoff in the match over Nitro, which Bischoff, right, Bischoff should have been at Starrcade 98 instead of Goldberg versus Kevin Nash. It should have been Hogan versus Hart, and they had success building up the Sting Hogan feud for a whole year. Why not take another year and build up Hogan Hart? But they didn't. They immediately turned Bret Hart heel. And again, Bret Hart's heel turn only worked in the WWF because they had the huge Canadian audience to build off the tensions between Canada and the US, because it really wasn't Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Bret Hart or even Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels that was driving it. It was the tensions between the two countries, the difference in, like we talked about, political philosophies between the two countries and cultural outlook between the two countries. That was building the feud, and the Hart Foundation were only representing that. And Austin and Shawn Michaels and Ken Shamrock and even Goldust, where the American wrestlers were representing the American side. That didn't exist in WCW. WCW's core fan base was still the Southern United States. So the tension had to be between Hart coming in as the new face of WCW. And it fits perfectly because WCW in 97 was representing wrestling tradition. They were representing the traditional wrestling, especially in Slamboree. when they had that 6 man, and the fact that Bret Hart and Roddy Piper are, really related in real life, although distantly, as cousins. Bret could have came in and represented the tradition of professional wrestling vis-a-vis Hulk Hogan, and that could have been the storyline. But Hogan's ego, Hogan still, even after the run that Hart had as WWF champion, he tied Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan won the championship 5 times. Bret won the championship 5 times, and that had been a lot for the WWE championship. No two guys had ever done that up until that point. It wasn't like when Russo took the book, title switch like crazy. They didn't really do that in the days of the WWF, you know, in the early years of the WWF. So those two guys each had 5 world championships, so they could have built off that. But they didn't. They turned Bret Hart heel. They made him an associate of Hollywood Hulk Hogan. They had him kissing Hogan's ass so much that he would show up on Nitro with a Hogan T-shirt on. Bret Hart would never do that. Kayfabe, why would Bret Hart kiss another man's ass? He was the one saying that he was the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Not Hulk Hogan. He would never, even as a babyface, he would never kiss Hulk Hogan's ass. He would never kowtow to Hulk Hogan. That's the exact same mistake WWE made at WrestleMania 9, making it like Hogan and Bret are best friends when they never had any contact with each other. They never had any. They never teamed with each other. What makes them best friends? What? Just because they were, just because one's a heel and one's a heel. In WCW's case or in WWE's case, one's a face, one's a face. No, Bret Hart is a better wrestler. Bret Hart is more into the technical side of wrestling, represents everything that Hulk Hogan doesn't. He's Canadian, number one. Hogan's the face of America. Hogan's the face of the guy who disrespects kayfabe, the guy who doesn't respect the traditions of technical wrestling. He's the opposite of Hart. That's the feud right there. That's the feud. One is the new generation, one is the older generation. That's the feud. But WCW didn't get that. WCW was, after 1994, just a company to appease Hulk Hogan's ego. Hulk Hogan didn't leave WWE and start his own promotion, but he went to WCW and completely took it over, and that was basically his promotion. Everything he wanted done got done, and everything he didn't want to get done didn't get done. You know what I mean? So you don't want to push Bret Hart? Fine, don't push Bret Hart. You don't want to push Steve Austin? Fine, don't push Steve Austin. And that's why they lost Steve Austin. That's why they lost Cactus Jack. That's why they lost Ron Simmons. All the guys who later went to WWF and became big stars in WWF and changed the landscape of wrestling went to WWF, not only from JR's urging, but also because Hulk Hogan didn't feel that they were stars. Hogan took the formula of if it ain't broke, don't fix it way too far, where he started to bring in everybody that he's ever wrestled before in WWF to WCW. Shit, he wanted to bring Giant Gonzalez back as the Yeti. He brought in Kamala. He brought in basically everybody that he ever faced. He put his friend Ed Leslie in the main event at Starrcade in 1994 and completely tanked the event. So they did, and like Bret Hart is in the mid card in WCW in 1998, wrestling Kurt Hennig. Now, Kurt Hennig and Bret Hart did have great matches. The great match at SummerSlam 91, the great match at King of the Ring 93. They had a tremendous chemistry, both second-generation wrestlers. But by the time Hennig came into WCW in 97, he already had the back injury. He was not the Kurt Hennig that he once was. And the match the feud he had with Bret Hart was subpar in WCW. Because it's like We've already seen Bret Hart climb to the top of the mountain. Why is he wrestling Kurt Hennig again? Why is he having to reestablish himself? And we already know who what he's capable of. And in Sold Out 98, when he wrestles Ric Flair, they actually do good business. And the Ric Flair and Bret Hart feud has nothing to do with the NWO. People like to see that it was a breather from the NWO, a breath of fresh air from the NWO. And then, too, later, they bring in Terry Funk. And Terry Funk, one of his first retirement matches in '97 that he had with Bret Hart. Bret Hart is the WWF champion. He's the ECW champion. They had a great match. They had tremendous chemistry. They did nothing with that. They did nothing with Sting versus Bret Hart until much, much later in '98 when it didn't matter. um, which Scorpion Deathlock versus Sharpshooter both had the same move. They could have did stuff with that. They could have did stuff with Benoit and Bret Hart. Why not have a Hart Foundation and instead of Brian Pillman, Benoit or Jericho in WCW? Both Canadian wrestlers, both trained by Stu Hart. Why not get Bret's family? Notice, this is always telling to me, Big Dog, when I look at WCW and Stu Hart never shows up in WCW. Stu and Helen are never at ringside in any of the WCW events, like they were always at ringside, and they even played a tremendous part in the storylines that Bret Hart was involved with in WWF. They never were in WCW. As a matter of fact, they continue to play a role in WWF storylines when they had the Dungeon match in '99 and the Lions Den match in '99 with Dan Severn and Owen Hart, respectively. Dan Severn versus Owen Hart and Ken Shamrock versus Owen Hart. In '99, you continue to see Stu featured in WWF programming and his family featured in WWF programming. You didn't see it in WCW. They completely ignored his existence in WCW. He and Helen and the rest of the family did. Yeah, they were too old to get involved with storylines, but they always, you know, my point is WCW never mentioned Hart's legacy. They never alluded to Bret Hart's legacy. We know what Bret Hart meant to the wrestling world and what his family meant to professional wrestling history because WWF was always mentioning it. WWF was always talking about the legacy, the Hart legacy, the family legacy, the dungeon, Calgary, hell, uh, me in America, me in the northeastern United States, New York City, would have never even known where the hell Calgary, Alberta, Canada even was had it not been for professional wrestling and watching Bret Hart's matches. You know what I mean? I'd have been like, where the hell's that? Somewhere in Jerusalem? Because of the similarities of Calgary and Calvary. You know what I mean? But I would have never even known where Alberta even is or what's the Hart Dungeon or anything. I know all this, and I became aware of all this because of wrestling, because of them always mentioning it. The Hart House, the Hart Dungeon. Stu Hart trained this guy. Stu Hart trained that guy. Stu Hart. His son. None of that was ever meant. They never brought that out in WCW. If you didn't watch Bret Hart in WWF, you would think Bret Hart is just some jabroni. you know, like, and it was by design. Um, it was by design in WCW because Hulk Hogan didn't want that mentioned. He didn't want Bret Hart to seem like Bret Hart was a big deal. Because in Hogan's mindset, he left the AWA, went to WWE, and he got WWE on fire. And then when he left, WWE died, and anything Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart or Undertaker or anybody were doing, that didn't matter. It was just what he had done, his legacy, what the guys he fought, the business he brought to the company. Anything after that was completely irrelevant in his mind. He thought of guys like Shawn Michaels and guys like Bret as mid carders. As in his words, he said this on several occasions, even on Michael Landsberg, a Canadian talk show host. He even said it on his show. Even he said that he looked at Bret Hart and guys like him as intercontinental guys. His words, intercontinental small guys. So he wasn't going to do business with Bret. But he's an employee, he's a wrestler. Eric Bischoff was the booker. He should be made, Kevin Sullivan was the booker, but Eric Bischoff was the boss. He's a wrestler. He should be made to do this. No, Hulk, you're going to work with Bret. That's going to be it. Vince wouldn't put up with it. Yeah, Vince conceded to Shawn Michaels not beating him at SummerSlam 2005, but he didn't concede to him not working with him. Yeah, I guess Vince conceded to him in 93. But then again, Vince never really believed in Bret either. Notice, even when he put the belt on Bret at WrestleMania 10 and got Bret's push really going, it was always a start and stop push with Bret. You get him going, and then he would take it off him and try to find somebody else, First it was Luger, then it was Diesel, then it was Shawn Michaels. Vince never really believed in Bret either. You know what I mean? So conceding to Hulk Hogan and saying, okay, yeah, Hulk, you don't. We all know the story. Hogan was supposed to face Bret at SummerSlam 93. And they have a confrontation. They take it back to Vince. And Vince says, no, Bret, that's what you thought you heard in that they were supposed to have a match at SummerSlam. No, Bret, that's what you thought you heard. So Vince and Hogan were of the same mindset that Bret was too small. Bret didn't have promo skills. They never believed in Benoit either. That was the reason why they never, when after they put the belt on Benoit, 10 years after they put the belt on Bret, it was almost the same thing. It was a start, stop, push, because they were Canadians and they were technical wrestlers. They didn't have promo skills. Daniel Bryan wasn't Canadian, but 10 years after Benoit, Daniel Bryan, same thing. You know what I mean? They never really believed in him. They didn't really put faith in him. They felt he didn't have charisma, that he was too small. So that's what Hogan thought when Bret was in WCW, and that's why Bret didn't go anywhere in WCW. And by the time Russo came in, he had his injury. But even Russo was off the mark because making Bret Hart the leader of the NWO Silver and Black, turning him, what was their fascination, I feel like, with Bret Hart's heel turn? Just because it worked in WWF, again, it was the countries, the dynamic of Canada and the United States that was driving it. They never really understood that. They thought Bret Hart was a better heel than a babyface, which he really wasn't. He was a better babyface than a heel. You know what I mean? Yeah, 97 was great, but again, what was what was behind the scenes about it, the subtext of it was what was driving it, not his heel persona. He never He was a better babyface. But both Russo and Eric Bischoff thought he was a better heel. By putting him with the NWO as the leader of the NWO, come on, that's cringe. You know, he should have been a babyface the whole time. You know, remember the night when he had the hockey jersey and he had the metal plate and Goldberg speared him and Goldberg was knocked out from the metal plate. That was the best work Red ever did as in WCW. That was the only memorable thing he ever did in WCW, and he could have did so much more if they knew what to do with him. But they often say they didn't know what to do with him. But yeah, he was. They say they didn't know what to do with him in WCW. But how could you not know what to do with him? Like, that's the most elementary thing ever. You had the biggest story in professional wrestling ever. Like, and you fucked it up. And we've seen this over and over with wrestling. We saw it with the invasion angle. Like, the easiest things professional wrestling bookers don't seem to get. The easiest, most common sense thing. People say, oh, well, the smart marks, they always armchair quarterback, Monday morning quarterbacking, think they know better than us, the people in professional wrestling. Because, well, why do we think that? Because you miss the most obvious things, the things that are fucking elementary, that a kindergartner or somebody that's been watching wrestling for a couple of months could figure out. Like, this was not hard. This was easy. The storyline wrote itself. He comes in as a face and he says, I'm not going to be screwed over again by people like Hulk Hogan who colluded with Vince McMahon. You put the same heat on Hogan that you had on Vince because they were partners in 93. You make reference to WrestleMania 9. Right, and uh, you make reference to WrestleMania. Big Dog is bringing up a point. The promoters think they're giving us the obvious. Then there is no surprise or shock element. Yeah, that's true. But sometimes the logical is what's needed. Sometimes you do need a shock element because it'll be boring otherwise. Like if Barry Windham never turns on Lex Luger, or if Zabisco never turns on Bruno, or Hogan never turns heel. Those are the kind of shock elements that you need. But turning Bret Hart into a heel as an ally of Hulk Hogan, how does that make sense? By how does that's the wrong kind of shock value? Or not introducing the WCW faction during the invasion until much, much later. That's the wrong kind of shock value. There's a good shock value, and then there's that's just stupid shock value. And unfortunately, that's rubbed off on Hollywood as well, because I have a video on it, The Last Jedi. They call it subverting our expectations, not doing what we expected. But you subverted our expectations in a bad way, something stupid. You know what I mean? Rather than going with the obvious, that would have made sense and would have been logical. Or the writers of Lost on the TV series Lost was always known for doing that. Going with something that's completely nonsensical and calling it a swerve. They must have got their education in television writing from some of the WWE writers. Hey, J.J. Abrams, how you doing? You know what I mean? So, yeah. But the obvious thing is like, okay, make some of the heat in WWF, put it on Hogan, say Vince and Hogan were in cahoots. Vince and Hogan were besties at that time. In 1993 and tried to screw over Bret Hart. He's not going to come to WCW and allow himself to be screwed again by a different promoter, Eric Bischoff, that's was kissing kissing Hulk Hogan's ass, and you bring some of the real elements of real life into it. Do it in a way that makes sense. Don't reference like some obscure thing like the Arn Anderson scissors incident with Sid when they brought that into the New Blood versus the Billionaires Club feud in 2000. It was like, okay, yeah, but nobody's ever heard of that. Nobody ever knew that happened until you referenced it on TV. You know. But with the Hogan thing, WrestleMania 9, that was on a pay per view. People knew about that. People saw it, right in front of their eyes. So you can reference an insider thing, but it has to be something that is widely known. It can't be something that, you know, just happened that nobody knew about. Like, they could tie this CM Punk thing in AEW into a storyline if they wanted to. You know what I mean? Even though Punk is not coming back, they could spin it to make him seem like he's the biggest heel in the world to their fans. Like, oh, look at CM Punk. You know, AEW put the rocket behind him, brought him out of his shell that he was in for 7 years away from wrestling, and this is how he thanks us. This is what he does. Bill Watts used to always do this too. When in his promotion in Mid South, when a wrestler would leave, he would he would get on the mic like when JYD left or Ultimate Warrior left. He would tell the people that the guy wasn't tough enough to continue to compete in Mid South wrestling anymore, and that would be the way that he would use their going away from the business as a way to booster his business. So if AEW was smart, they would exploit the hell out of this, and they would make CM Punk look like the most unprofessional motherfucker in the world. But Tony Khan doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand. He can never be a politician because he doesn't understand spin. Like you saw him with that interview with Ariel Helwani and on the MMA hour, and it's like he doesn't even want to talk about MJF's contract disputes or the CM Punk incident. He wants to completely gloss over it. And it's like, it's making your company look weak and it's making you look like a weak bitch, by refusing to address the situation. You got to put your spin on the situation and you got to make CM Punk look like the ultimate heel, like what Vince McMahon did after the screw job, or tried to do, because Vince thought that the fans of the WWF were going to be more loyal to him and they were going to look at Brett as the heel. But they looked at him as the heel. But with this, the AEW zombies are so loyal to CM Punk that Tony Khan, if he was smart, could make him himself and AEW look like the biggest bay faces in the world if they knew how to spin it, especially on a legitimate promoter's podcast like Ariel Helwani, somebody that is involved with MMA. But they don't know how to do that, so they just ignore it and hope it goes away. That yeah. Promoters think that's subverting our expectation, but they do it in a bad way, big dog. They don't know how to do it. You know what I mean? They sometimes do know how to do it, like in the Survivor Series '98, but most of the time, when they go the opposite direction and they swerve us just for the sake of swerving us, it's like, well, why? And with wrestling promoters too, they don't know how to. They really don't know how to switch gears. And Russo is as guilty of this as any other wrestling booker and promoter, because when the Montreal Screwjob, not that he booked it or not that it was his idea, but Not that he booked it or not that it was his idea, backstage politics, but not that he. But when the Montreal Screwjob was so successful, he tried again and again to do the same thing, and it just didn't have the same effect. And promoters are always doing this. A black babyface works for Bill Watson Mid South with JYD, so he tries it again after JYD leaves by putting it on George Wells or putting it on Butch Reed or putting it on just any random black guy, or and it doesn't work the same. A muscle-bound babyface, all-American babyface works for Vince and Hulk Hogan, and then he tries it again with Luger, and it doesn't work. The Von Erichs, they work for Fritz, but after his son started dying, he puts the Von Erich name on Lance Von Erich, and fans just spit it out. You know what I mean? So they think by going back to the well over and over and over and doing something again, a cheap version or an imitation of something that worked tremendously before, is going to work again, not really realizing that audiences evolve and tastes change. You want to see the same sort of effect with a different sort of storyline. It's not going to keep working over and over and over again. And they always do this. They always, and Bret Hart alludes to this in the Wrestling with Shadows documentary. The promoters treat wrestlers like circus animals, and they beat them and they beat them and they beat them until it doesn't work anymore. You know what I mean? And they always do that. A big storyline works, and they try it over and over. And so with the NWO too, they try it over and over and over and over, and they think it will work again and again, and it just doesn't. You know what I mean? The boss versus the employees dynamic worked with Austin and McMahon, but it didn't work with Roman Reigns versus the Authority. And that's the biggest reason I feel, besides politics, like Big Dog is saying, why wrestling is cyclical, like it goes in boom and bust periods, because wrestling promoters, like, they don't like to switch gears. They'll find a formula that works and they'll try it over and over and over again. Same thing with Vern Gagne. He big muscle bound baby face, tough baby face. It worked with Hogan, and he right. Fans get tired of repetition. Vern Gagne tried it with, and they do repetition, but with a lesser person. Like the heel turn worked with Hogan, but it didn't work with Bret Hart reforming. How many times they reformed the NWO? How many times did they reform DX, thinking that it would always work? With The Rock, what kept The Rock fresh was that he never got overused. That's what kept The Rock fresh in people's minds. He never got overused. But with most things in wrestling, you'll see it, and you'll see it today, and you'll see it for the 20th. You'll see it for the 20th time the next 50 years from now. And fans will just tune out because it can only work once. And wrestling promoters have always done that. 1979, this two below concession stand match happens. It's a big thing. They're using mustard, they're using condiments in a match. And then they tried it 50 other times later in Memphis, and it doesn't work. A non-wrestling celebrity worked in 1982 with Andy Kaufman. They tried again with Logan Paul, and it doesn't work. Or they tried again with Jay Leno, and it doesn't work. Mr. T works at WrestleMania 1, but he doesn't work in 1994 against Kevin Sullivan. He no longer matters in that way. NWO works in 96, but doesn't work in 2000. But if you've watched wrestling for long enough, you start to see, man, they're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And maybe it's meant to be that way. Maybe it's meant to be as you become older, like you watch wrestling for, say, 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, and then you grow out of it, and then a new generation experiences it the same but similar or the same type of storyline over and over again with virgin eyes. Maybe that's right. That too. You know, and wrestling promoters always think, oh well, this worked before, so this will work again. No, because tastes change. And there's never, even Vince McMahon, even the most successful wrestling promoter ever, has there ever been a wrestling promoter that remained fresh and relevant ever? They've all hit a point where, okay, their ideas are just stale. You know, they have like one or two ideas that work wildly successful, do a tremendous amount of business in that area or that company for a while, and then all of a sudden it all implodes. Nobody's had a time when they, well, a sustained period of longevity in the business because they don't. Each promoter only has like one or two good ideas. That usually happen by accident. You know what I mean? Like Hulk Hogan became a babyface in the AWA by accident. You know what I mean? They brought him as a heel, and Dick the Bruiser quits the company like he often did, and they need another babyface to go against Bockwinkel, and they bring in Hogan, and off the cachet of Rocky 3, he becomes the biggest star in wrestling at that time. Hogan and Warrior, that was an accident because they were supposed to have Hogan and Mike Tyson at first. That was the original plan for WrestleMania 6, but Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, and then he got into his legal trouble. And then they were supposed to have Hogan versus Zeus. That was supposed to be the culmination of that instead of the cage match that they had. But Zeus quit the company. So they went with Hogan and Warrior by accident, and it was successful. But when they tried to engineer it, and they tried to steer it in that direction in '98, it was a bust because these things happen organically. You can't engineer it. You can't mastermind it. You couldn't mastermind the NWO, really. It just so happened that Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's contracts were both up in WWF when they made the jump in '96. You couldn't engineer the Montreal Screwjob. You couldn't engineer JYD's success in Mid-South in the '80s or the Von Erichs. You can't. These biggest things in story in wrestling history, you can't engineer it. You can't plan it. It just happens, and it happens by accident, by happenstance. That's how it is. And when they have a success like that and they try to do that, it never pans out. It always failure because they don't understand why it happens. They just know it happens, and they think they could catch lightning in a bottle the second time, and you can't. You can't replicate the circumstances that existed the first time it happened and why it was so great. And that ties us into Montreal and the biggest happenstance success in wrestling history, in a night that I feel changed professional wrestling 25 years ago. But anyway, thank you, Big Dog, for contributing. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Subscriber numbers up. Love you guys. Peace.